My guest is Allan Kozinn. He and Adrian Sinclair are the authors of the McCartney Legacy Volume 2, 1974 to 1980. Allan, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Allan, you and Adrian talked to many former members of Wings for this book, including a few who rarely give interviews to tell the story of Paul during this period. Talk about who you interviewed in the previous interviews you did with people behind the scenes, like engineers and producers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for both these books, we spoke to everyone we could find who worked with Paul. I mean, there are thousands of people more who've worked with Paul. We tried to get the most important people, and obviously that would include the surviving members of Wings. And it wasn't always easy because in this volume. Wings had sort of fallen apart at the end of Volume 1, right before they went to record Band on the Run, and Paul and Linda and Denny did that on their own. Um, they needed a new guitarist and a new drummer. The guitarist, Jimmy McCulloch, died sadly at a very young age in maybe 1976 or 70, well, 77, I believe. He was in Wings until 77. The drummer that they first got was Jeff Britton, who didn't last all that long, but did some significant work, especially this year. They've released for the first time the one hand clapping sessions, and Jeff was the drummer on that, and he did excellent work, and I think that will help sort of restore his reputation because, all a lot of people know, Wings fans know, is that he was sort of kicked out of the group during the recording of Venus and Mars, and they brought in Joe English. So Jeff hadn't given an interview for decades, and we finally were able to convince him. Adrian, in particular, was, and in fact, they've become friends. And Jeff provided us with his diary, which was very helpful. In the first volume, Denny Seiwell, Wing's first drummer, also had a diary, or his wife did. And those really helped us establish sort of, concrete timelines because when they went in the studio, it was in the diary. And, everything they did basically it wasn't like a personal diary in that way. It was a diary of, professional engagements. Um, and then Joe English became the drummer after Jeff. And the problem with Joe is that after the 1975-76 tour and then some work on London Town, he just got very homesick. Plus, his wife was not happy living in London, so Paul offered to get them a house, all that stuff, if she'd relocate. And she went there for a while and said, I'm just not, I just don't like this. I mean, she was living in rural Georgia, and that was the life she preferred. So she went back, got in a horrible car accident, and so Joe is on the other side of the ocean and going back as much as he can. And he finally decided that he really wanted to go back to the States, go back to Georgia, and he left as well. And when he did, he joined sort of a few years later, joined a Christian community and basically put his rock and roll life behind him, and didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to remember those days, any of that stuff. And we finally got him basically a few days before the book was due. And we had to sort of go back. I mean, we had found interviews with him from the time, which we used, and we found a few interviews he had done for the TV station of the Christian community that he lives in, and we used those. But we really wanted to talk to him. And when we finally got him, he still was very reluctant to talk about his time in Wings. But we got him to confirm some things and to give us some statements about certain, important things that they went through, and we sort of revised the book on the eve of submitting it to accommodate Joe.
Wow. How did you get him to open up at least just a little bit, at least. What was it? Persistence? Did you feel comfortable after a while?
It was persistence. I don't think he ever was totally comfortable.
Yeah.
And he really just didn't, because the whole world of rock, people associated, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the life he's living now, he doesn't want to even think about those times. So those aspects of it, we didn't talk to him about. We tried to talk about really just the music making, which from our point of view is the most important thing anyway. Also, we spoke to people that maybe no one would have heard of, like designers that like Stephen Thomas was a designer who designed MPL's headquarters. MPL is Paul's company in London, oversees his publishing and everything about his career. And they bought a building in Soho Square, which Paul wanted entirely renovated, and he had very specific ideas of what he wanted, and hired these guys to do it, and then invited him up to Scotland and said, I want to build a studio in this particular former cow barn. Um, and I have an idea to record a song, which was Mull of Kintyre, and it was about Scotland, and he wanted it to be recorded in Scotland, and he wanted his studio on his farm to be there, and he gave Thomas 1 month to build this studio.
Wow.
And he wanted it locally built. He said, people here work very hard. A lot of them are out of work. Hire them to do this. He had like 2 8-hour shifts a day, uh, and they got it built in a month and recorded Mull of Kintyre there. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, these are the stories that I love, though. These are the people that tell stories that help to round out these artists.
Yeah.
For Paul, how he was from in terms of how he was to work with, work for, what his work ethic was like. There was an interesting quote from Linda in the book where she talked about how he loved being around positivity, positive people. He didn't want to be around negative. The things like that are interesting. Just to find out a little bit more about Paul as an artist. And 69 to 73, that first volume, that's a period where Paul's still trying to establish himself as a solo artist, not be remembered for just the Beatles. Where is he at in terms of how he's viewed by the media and the fans in that aspect in 1974?
In the first volume, he was, as you said, trying to sort of crawl out from the wreckage of the Beatles and reestablish himself, and it was difficult. A lot of his albums took, a lot of criticism, and he felt this, and finally, at the end of that volume, they record Band on the Run, and Band on the Run finally brought him back to the status that he was used to. So 1974 starts with Paul in a really good place. I don't think, well, Band on the Run hadn't quite hit #1 yet, but within the next year, it would hit #1 like 3 times on the Billboard charts. Um, and that gave him a level of confidence that he had been looking for all through, the period that was covered in Volume 1. And then it meant that he had to sort of maintain that, and that was difficult because, you know, Venus and Mars was not quite as well received as Band on the Run, and the album subsequently took lots of critical barbs as well. So, it was difficult, but the thing about Paul is that, he has very open ears for one thing. I mean, he listens very closely to what's going on in the whole music world. He doesn't just assume, okay, I am Paul McCartney and my way or the highway. He listens. And so at the beginning of the book, we have sort of the end of the sort of glam rock period. And by the end of the book, punk is coming in and going out and disco is coming in. And he embraced all of those styles and incorporated them into his music without losing his own musical personality. Um, he just was intent on staying current, and he understood that, unlike during the Beatles times where they were always the leaders, now he had to sort of listen to what's going on, and he freely took ideas from all over the place. He went when he took Wings to Nashville for sort of a break-in period. And while they were there, they went to concerts. They saw David Bowie. And in his 1974 tour, Bowie used a brass section. And Paul had earlier seen the Stones in New York during a break on an earlier Wings tour, and they used the brass section too. So Paul began thinking, okay, brass section, interesting idea. He went to see Led Zeppelin in 1975, and first of all, they had an incredible sound rig, unlike anything he was used to seeing in concert. So he hired the company that did their sound rig and had them build something even more spectacular for Wings' American tour. I mean, that at the time was like the biggest kind of technical tour that had gone out yet. Um, and at the same time, from the Led Zeppelin show, he noticed that they had an acoustic set within the middle of their show. And so he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So when Wings went out in 75 to Australia and then later to America in 76, he had, a rock section first, then stop, have an acoustic set, play Yesterday, Blackbird, various things, and then back to the full band. And that was an idea that basically had roots in him seeing this Led Zeppelin show at Earl's Court in London.
Yeah, and he also followed the top 40, right? Would always pay close attention who was in the top 40.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Like you said, yeah, he's with the Beatles, he wasn't they were setting the trends, and now he's in a different position, but he's not, like you said, he also doesn't have that ego like, yeah, I'm Paul McCartney. I'll just, whatever I write, people are going to love. But my question, though, is what was the difference with Band on the Run as opposed to the previous work that he was doing as a solo artist that was not catching on with, the type of audience that Band on the Run did?
Well, it's hard to say. With the first album, he recorded that on his own, partly in his house, partly at EMI and other studios, but playing all the instruments himself. And people complained that it was a little too homespun, even though it had Maybe I'm Amazed on it, which is one of his most enduring tracks. Um, so then he went to New York and recorded Ram and had session musicians, had an orchestra, really focused on it being a polished record, unlike the first McCartney album. And the reaction was, well, this is way too slick. So then he wants a band because he wants to tour. So he puts together the first iteration of Wings. They only rehearse for like 2 or 3 days before going to the studio, and they did Wildlife pretty quickly. And the criticism of that was that it was a little too ramshackle. Well, okay. Now he's a little dispirited. Red Rose Speedway kind of took a long time to make because they went on tour in between, and it's hard to characterize that album because it was supposed to be a double album that would show Wings as a band, and EMI basically forced him to make it a single album, which made it more of a solo McCartney album because a lot of the tracks that were thrown off it were things that other band members were singing and or things like that. Uh, so Band on the Run, I think part of what happened was, first of all, he had an extraordinary collection of songs for that. Band on the Run itself is really quite a dramatic piece, and it had its roots in a meeting where They were discussing the breakup of Apple, and it was, they had to attend, and none of them liked going to business meetings. And, he's sitting there writing, if I ever get out of here, when, first line of Band on the Run. So, he had that, and he had Jet, and Mrs. Vanderbilt, 1985. I mean, he just had an exceptional number of really good tunes, but he also had a special impetus to make that a great album, which is that on the eve of their trip to Lagos, Nigeria, where he wanted to record this for various reasons, uh, Denny Seiwell, the drummer, and Henry McCulloch, the lead guitarist, quit. So it was just the three of them. And, Paul there's an aspect of Paul's personality which can be summarized as, I'll show you. Um, in a way, his career after the Beatles was partly, I'll show you. I'm not going to just stop. I'm going to keep going and I'm going to do my thing. And now he's in Lagos, Nigeria with just the three of them. He's doing the drums himself. He's doing a lot of the stuff himself. And now he had two groups of people to show, the Beatles and the first iteration of Wings. It's like, okay, you're not going to leave me and think I'm not going to do a great album. I'm going to do the best album we've done. And that drive, I think, really pushed him to make it an exceptionally good album, and it worked. I mean, it's not like he didn't always want to make exceptionally good albums, but here he had that extra impetus of proving himself, um, when other people around him had sort of given up on the idea of Wings.
Yeah, that lit the fire.
Yeah.
That lit the fire. You mentioned Jet. One of the early stories in the book is about Jet, how the record label wanted to release it as a single, but Paul wasn't convinced it was a good single. They actually had to convince him. Al Curry from
Yeah.
Capitol Records had to convince Paul.
It
Why was
was
he opposed to it?
Well, it wasn't so much that he didn't think it would be a good single, is that he didn't think singles should be taken off albums,
That's right.
and this was where time was outpacing him a little bit, because in the early 60s, the Beatles had that policy, we keep singles and albums separate, and that was actually pretty common in Britain among British groups. They released singles, they released albums, and rarely the twain should meet. It did in a few cases with the Beatles, because obviously the title songs of Hard Day's Night and Help were going to be on those albums. It was, and there were some other times, Yellow Submarine off Revolver, things like that. But he, generally speaking, liked the idea of keeping albums and singles separate. And in fact, the British version of Band on the Run does not have Helen Wheels on it, because that was a single. And Al Corey called him the first time about that. And Paul said, okay, okay, I'll put the song on the album, but only on the American release of the album, not on the British one. So Helen Wheels went on there, and the next thing Paul knew, uh, Al Corey wanted to release Jet, and he had to persuade Paul that, look, our experience is that when we take a single from the album, it really helps sell the album. And that was persuasive to Paul, and he let him do it. The problem was that, it's a fairly long song, not quite as long as Hey Jude, but, radio liked it maybe a minute shorter, and radio stations were doing their own edits. And so Capitol did an edit. And for the one and only time, Paul didn't feel he needed to hear the edit before it went out. But then he was in LA driving along, and he heard the edit on the radio.
Sunset
And
Boulevard, right? I think he said he's driving
yeah,
along.
and the edit really is a pig's dinner. I don't know if you've heard it, but
No, but edits drive me mad because I just love the song as it was intended to be.
Mhm. Yeah. And so he called, it was one of these great scenes where, he calls his manager at MPL in London. They call Capitol Records and call the guys. Well, Paul's in LA and he's on the phone to us and he's heard this track and he thinks it's awful. And Al Corey was able to say, well, we don't know what Paul actually heard, whether it's our edit or a radio station edit. So we'll tell him it's a radio station edit. But thereafter, Paul listened to all of the edits before they went out. And Band on the Run was edited and other songs subsequently.
That's a great story. Let Me Roll It is one of my favorite Paul McCartney deep tracks. It's one of my favorites, and that's on Band on the Run. Great song.
Yeah.
Great song. There's a visit from Yoko that Paul and Linda get in late March of 74, an unexpected visit. Can you talk about that visit, what was discussed, and how it sparked a jam session with Paul and John?
Yoko went to London, visited Paul and Linda, and this is not a very well documented visit. Paul, we only found out about it really because Paul mentioned it in passing in an interview, and we began to sort of put things together because we were trying to figure out how this trip to LA that Paul and Linda took that ended up in that jam came about. And it turned, we thought maybe Paul went to New York to visit the Eastmans, which he did regularly. The Eastmans were Linda's parents, and Lee Eastman and John Eastman, Linda's father and brother, were Paul's managers and lawyers. Um, so it turned out that Yoko went there and Paul asked, what's going on with John, because John was living in Los Angeles with May Pang and working out there, and he was getting into all kinds of trouble if he happened to drink too much in public. A lot of famous stories about that.
The Lost Weekend that lasted a year, right?
Right. A year and a half.
Yeah.
Um, but he would do things like get drunk and heckle the Smothers Brothers and get thrown out of the Troubadour, that kind of, and that would get into the papers, obviously. So Paul wanted to know what's going on, had a heart to heart with Yoko, and asked Yoko, would you want Paul back? Would you want John back? And she said yes, but he'd have to woo me. He'd have to, we'd have to go out on dates. He'd have to get me flowers, all that stuff. And so Paul and Linda flew to LA, found out that John was in a recording session working on Harry Nilsson's Pussycats album, went to the studio, and also at the same time, Stevie Wonder was working in that studio complex and came down the hall and visited, and they all went in and had a jam, which was recorded. And it's, the one reel of it that has made its way out into the public is really not that great a jam. Um, but it's possible that they went on to fill several more reels because Paul talks about that session going until the, really early hours of the morning. And May Pang in her book talks about an incredible version of Midnight Special that they played at that jam. And that's not on that tape that's out. So it's very possible that there's more and that it's better than what we've heard. But the next day they went to where John and May were living, and Harry Nilsson was there, and Keith Moon, Ringo, Mal Evans, all sitting around the pool. And Paul took John into a room by himself and said, "So listen, do you want to get back with Yoko?" And John said, "Yeah." And Paul said, "Okay, I've seen Yoko, and this is what you have to do." I mean, it's almost as if they were living out the lyrics of "She Loves You."
Yeah. That's true.
Well, I saw her yesterday.
Right.
You
Yeah.
just think, yeah. So, he told John what Yoko had told him, and then strangely enough, he went back to New York, went to the circus with his daughters, and then flew back to LA because they wanted to go to the Academy Awards. So, talk about a jet setter.
Speaking of the Beatles, it was almost a handful of years since they disbanded, but in 1974, they're still battling over business
Yeah.
dealings, right? The Apple negotiations. What were the disagreements over, and how do they ultimately settle?
Well, the disagreements were really over how to divide up the money because all the money was going into Apple, including Paul's solo records, the royalties for that were going into Apple because the contract that they had with EMI treated solo projects and Beatles projects basically the same. Whatever it was, Apple would be paid. And Paul tried to get EMI to pay him directly, but they wouldn't do it because that's not what the contract said. And this had a lot ramifications for instance, how he could run Wings. I mean, he was funding Wings out of his pocket. Basically, he was paying the players a salary, which they were complaining wasn't enough, and and it made it very difficult not having access to the royalties for his own recordings, let alone the Beatles stuff. And it took a really long time, I mean, years, to finally sort that out. And by the time they sorted it out, instead of scuttling Apple, which was the original intention, they decided it would be useful to keep Apple to oversee the Beatles' relationship with EMI and other places that they have a business partnership with. For instance, today, Disney, you know, they're doing things through Disney like the Beatles 64 documentary and the Get Back documentary and all of these things. If Apple had been scuttled and it was just the four guys individually doing their thing, it might be sort of difficult to do all this.
Mm.
Plus, this will become more important in volume three when we do it, because by the 80s, they were suing EMI. They started suing EMI in this volume, actually, over various accounting issues. Um, and that suit wasn't settled until 1989. And when it was, it gave the Beatles absolute say over how their music is put out by EMI. So, for instance, in this volume, EMI puts out the rock and roll music compilation and the love songs compilation and stuff like that. And the Beatles can't stop it. And they just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's nothing to us. They own the tapes. In 1989, the settlement was okay, EMI owns the tapes, but you cannot make any compilations or put out any unreleased stuff or anything without our being involved.
That's huge.
Yeah, it was huge. But it required having a place like Apple to make that kind of deal, for the four of them to stand as a unit. So it's kind of interesting that, they took years to take Apple apart only to keep it together.
Yeah.
But they did get their individual money, and that was the issue. And what made it complicated were things like, the way the Beatles had often sort of worked and lived is, they went and got something and sent the bill to Apple. So John's living expenses, for instance, in New York at the Dakota, all went to Apple, and John had spent something like $2 million. And the others are saying, well, I didn't necessarily spend $2 million, so we can't now divide this chunk up absolutely evenly. We have to account for the bills that we have each put in to Apple. And that got really, really complicated.
I'm sure. I'm
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. And with
Plus,
inflation, $2 million then, what is what today, right?
like 10 times as much.
John
So
was, yeah, John was having some fun.
that's the thing in writing this book, we were constantly going to these historical currency conversion charts,
Right.
and it changes over the period of the book. But, at the beginning, it was like 10 times the amount, like 10 pounds is 100 pounds today. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. You go into detail in the auditions that Paul held to find a new drummer. These are the fun little facts that you find in this book, too. Mitch Mitchell from the Jimi Hendrix Experience was among the guys who auditioned for the role of drummer. Ultimately, Jeff Britton gets the gig. Jimmy McCulloch, you mentioned earlier, he's on guitar. So you have the lineup of Paul on lead vocals and bass, Linda on keyboards, Denny Lane on rhythm guitar, McCulloch and Britton. And they recorded the standalone single Junior's Farm, which I want to ask you about now. You write, quote, musically, Junior's Farm is an unusually simple song with a purely visceral appeal. Talk about that, and also how impressive Paul was in quickly putting this song together in the studio.
Paul had the basis of that song. This is a song they recorded in Nashville during their, 3 weeks they were there to sort of break in the band. But he had written the basis of it, at least musically, when he was still back in England. And Jeff Britton remembers it being one of the audition pieces. Um, Basically, Paul wanted to see what a drummer would do with a piece of music that nobody knew, and how he would follow Paul's lead and all of that. And it's a nice rocker with some eccentric lyrics. It turned out that although Paul started this in England, Junior was the a nickname of Curly Putman, whose house Paul and Wings were staying at during their time in Nashville. Curly was a songwriter, uh, a country songwriter, and he basically rented his house to Paul and went off to Hawaii on vacation. Now, Paul and Wings should not technically have been recording in Nashville because they were not there with that kind of visa. Um, but their fixer in Nashville, Buddy Killen, who owned a Nashville publishing company, and Curly Putnam was one of his songwriters, uh, also owned a studio in Nashville. And he basically finessed it with the musicians union and anybody else who would ask so that Paul and Wings could do some recording there, just sort of under the radar. And they went in and it took, I go into in the book various aspects of what it took to make the song work, because they rehearsed it during their rehearsal sessions at Curly's place, Junior's farm. Uh, and they didn't have a beginning that Paul liked, and what do we do with the solo? And so it really took some doing before they got an arrangement that Paul was happy with, and then went into the studio and did it relatively quickly. And that's the first thing that Jeff was on, and Jeff and Jimmy as a member of Wings, because Jimmy recorded with them before. Jimmy recorded actually in volume one. He went to a session with Paul and Linda and Denny in Paris right after they finished Band on the Run, to record some of Linda's things. And that was partly to audition, you know, Jimmy, and there was another drummer who ended up not staying with him because he had made a commitment to someone else. Then in the beginning of 74, they recorded Mike McGear's album, Paul's Brother, which was basically a Stealth Wings album,
Yeah, that's interesting. That's in your book. Yeah, that's a really fascinating
Yeah, that's the first
part of the
chapter.
book. Yeah,
And Paul co-wrote almost everything on the album with Mike. He was pretty experimental, and but he also was auditioning Jimmy, and the drummer for that was Jerry Conway, who he invited to join Wings, but Jerry Conway had committed to tour with Cat Stevens, so he felt he couldn't take the gig. And like everyone who doesn't take a gig with Paul, he says, I can't do it now because I've got these commitments, but I hope you'll consider me in the future. And they never get considered in the future. You only say no to Paul once.
yeah,
So they did Junior's Farm there, and it's a nice straightforward rocker,
yeah.
which was kind of one thing Paul sort of needed, because he's very prone to doing a ballad. I mean, that's what he excels at. And
Those
people
silly
think
love songs.
that's right, and people think of him as that, but he can rock too, and so Junior's Farm sort of fulfilled that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. His passion for science fiction
Hmm.
is little known unless you're a McCartney diehard, because I didn't really know about this. Talk about that and how it influenced the follow up to Band on the Run, which is Venus and Mars, and its title track.
he is into sci-fi, and it's, as you say, not that well known, but he went off to Jamaica on one of his frequent vacations. And it's really interesting because he goes on more vacations than anybody I've ever seen, and yet a vacation for him is also work because he
Yeah,
never comes home empty-handed. He always comes home with a bunch of songs, you know.
yeah, yeah. It's like
Uh,
he goes there to get inspiration.
yeah, yeah. And they had started working on the tracks that would become Venus and Mars, but then took a break and he went to Jamaica and he had the songs all written out for that album and basically arranged exactly the flow of the album start to finish in Jamaica. But while he was there, he also bought a stack of Marvel comics and some Isaac Asimov books. I think he was reading Foundation at the time, on the beach. That was just beach reading for him. And it occurred to him as well. Well, before we get there, Venus and Mars, the title song, the sci-fi aspects of that are pretty obvious. And he's envisioning it as someone waiting for a spaceship to come and collect him, uh, then Magneto and Titanium Man is, basically right out of Marvel Comics. And he just sort of, made up a song that would work with those characters. And, so Venus and Mars had this sort of edging towards sci-fi kind of feeling in a way. Um, but there were other things in it too, like, rock show and, lonely old people. It's, it wasn't totally sci-fi and it wasn't a concept album, anything like that. But that was what was on his mind during that trip in Jamaica. And so he decided, why don't I do a film for Wings? I mean, this had been on his mind. The Beatles did Hard Day's Night and Help. He thought Wings could be in a film of their own, and that would, you know, be a good thing for the group. And so after Jamaica, he went to New York because this was the end of the year, and he basically went to New York for Christmas every year, hung out with the Eastmans and Linda's family. Uh, and had the Eastmans arrange a meeting with Isaac Asimov. And, I mean, because you're Paul McCartney, you want a film script, you have an idea, you want someone to help you with it, you go to the top. And Isaac Asimov was, you don't get better. So they met. Isaac Asimov took Paul's idea and revised it pretty considerably and sent Paul back his 1,800 word preliminary treatment for what this film could be, where these, you know, Paul's idea was, five aliens land on Earth and they sort of morph into a copy of Wings. And then the film is sort of, in a way, a battle between the real Wings and the space alien Wings. Isaac Asimov decided, it would be better if these are sort of wraith-like creatures. How they look, we can determine later, but they land on Earth and they sort of inhabit Wings, you know. Uh, so it was a different kind of story. It ended up as a love conquers all kind of thing, and sent it to Paul. Paul had doubts about it. It wasn't quite what he wanted to do because, really, I think what Paul wanted Asimov to do was turn his idea as it was into a film script, not necessarily change it as much as Asimov did. And so he rejected it, and Asimov's um, uh, Asimov's treatment is in the Boston University Library with all of his papers, and so we went and got it. And scrolled across the front of the treatment is nothing became of this because McCartney doesn't recognize good stuff.
Was McCartney or is McCartney, is he a perfectionist? Because it doesn't seem that way. It just seems like he has a vision and that's the way he wants it. Or is he a perfectionist?
Well, he's a perfectionist in the sense that he wants it to be what his vision is, and he'll keep doing it until it is that. Um, in volume one, again, I should be talking about volume two, but people can go buy them both.
Sure,
But
yeah.
in volume one, when they're recording High, 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 I mean, he did hundreds of takes. He tried to use a live version and then didn't like the live version, so did overdubs onto the live version. And then that became too unwieldy, so they went back to the studio, started from scratch. Yeah, he is a perfectionist and he wants it his own way, and that for him is what perfectionism is. He has a vision of a song and how he wants it to sound, and he'll just keep doing it until it sounds that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was a lot of pressure on him now. Solo artist, which as we get towards the end of the book, we get to that point where he's kind of feeling like, yeah, I think I need to move on from Wings, but we'll get to that.
Mm.
But Venus and Mars released in May of 75, backing up a bit earlier that year. There was a possibility of John recording with Paul, or was that really going to happen? And what became of that plan?
That really, it was going to happen. And people, I ran when we were writing this, I ran into a lot of people who said, Maypang says that, but is that really true? I mean, do we have anything other than May say so? And it turns out we do. We have a letter that John wrote to Derek Taylor, who had been a head of publicity at Apple, and he was an extraordinary character. He did all kinds of things, um, but they remained friends after the breakup, and John would send him postcards and letters and things. And Derek actually, in one of his books, reproduced this letter. And it's a book, Derek did these books for Genesis Publications, which is a limited edition British company that puts out, beautifully done leather bound volumes. And so this is a book that, there aren't that many copies of it around, but I have one, and I was sort of looking through it for any indication of anything we might need. And what did I find but a letter from John saying, "Yeah, I'm going to go down to New Orleans and see the McCartneys, and we'll see what happens." So
Wow. Yeah.
yeah, so that's confirmation. But what happened was John at that point ended up getting back with Yoko. Um, Pretty much right about when he would have had to go down to New Orleans. And, if you're reconstructing your marriage, it's not necessarily the ideal time to go flying off and work with one of your friends. So he decided to stay in New York with Yoko. And that was, to the relief of Paul's manager at MPL, Alan Crowder, who said in an interview at a certain point that, I think if John does come, it's just going to distract Paul, and it's going to throw everything off course. It would be much better if he
Mm,
didn't come. But no one is going to assert to Paul that John shouldn't come, you know.
right, right. The
Uh,
distraction being, because I was going to ask about their relationship, was the distraction maybe they were very competitive. Like neither of each other complimented each other's work, right?
right.
Didn't John take one of Paul's albums and use it as a frisbee? And
Yeah.
so was that the case?
Yeah, I mean, but they were very competitive even within the Beatles, and
Yeah.
and that's possibly one reason the Beatles were as great as they were. You have two
Yeah.
excellent songwriters trying to top each other all the
And
time.
there we go back to, yeah, Paul needing that fire lit underneath him to really step it up.
Hmm.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
It's interesting to think about what would have happened because, as I said, Paul had Venus and Mars totally planned out on that trip to Jamaica, and the album they recorded is the album he mapped out in this scroll that he put together with, each page was a different song, and he sort of taped them together and rolled it up, and that was the scroll that was the map for Venus and Mars. Well, if John turned up, what would have happened? Would they have set the scroll aside and maybe the two of them done some new stuff, or
Yeah.
maybe they have called George and Ringo and said, "Why don't you get down here? We got some stuff."
Yeah.
Those, you know.
When was the Saturday Night Live story? That was the story about
Yeah, that
the
was
Lorne
April
Michaels wanted them.
24th, April 24th, 1976.
Okay.
Paul was visiting John at the Dakota. Paul was about to tour America with Wings Over America, that tour.
And George was the musical guest on SNL that night.
No,
No.
George turned up later in the year, I think, in fact, might have even been in 78 around
Okay.
Thanksgiving. Yeah. Um, it was just the two of them, and they were watching, and Lorne Michaels, held up his $3,000 check and said, "I'd like to invite the Beatles to come. If you want to pay Ringo less, that's keep me out of it. Divide it
Yes.
up however you want." And they thought, well, should we go down there? I don't, and then they decided not to. But then that became sort of an interesting research issue too, because there are a lot of discussions on Beatles chat boards and on Facebook and in various places where people are saying, because Paul, in a later interview, said, well, okay, you know what? John and I really weren't together that time. I went a week later and John told me about it. So
Okay.
we've got Paul telling that story both ways, and we've got John telling the story where, he and Paul were together and watched the show. We don't know why Paul decided that he wasn't with John and that he went the next week, but we looked into it, and mapping it out and taking Saturday Night Live's broadcast schedule and Paul's touring schedule, and there is no possibility that Paul and John could have watched Saturday Night Live together at any other time that year except April 24th, the night that Lorne Michaels actually made the offer for the Beatles reunion for $3,000. So we're pretty convinced that they really did watch it together.
Yeah. Man,
I
I
can't.
don't know. I was, for some reason, I thought George was there that night, but the story would have been that they would have called George and Ringo, and the four of them would all meet up. Well, that's the thing with Paul. Sometimes you get different variations on the stories behind songs of his, right? Like sometimes it's like, oh, I wrote that after my pet. And then in another interview, he says, no, no, I wrote that about a friend of mine who's, right? Isn't
Right.
that what,
He does change his mind sometimes, or simply forget.
right, right? Because it's a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, and it turns out that the Beatles are, in fact, human, just like the rest of us, and they
Who
have
knew?
memory
Right.
issues like we all do. I mean, um, I think every one of us in our lives has stories that we tell, and someone else who was there will say, "No, it wasn't that way," and who's right, But Paul, at the time he wrote Jet, for instance, he said that the name was taken from a dog.
Right.
That, it was the runt of the litter, and he really liked it, and it was black, and they called it Jet, and he used that as the title. If you look in his lyrics book, he will tell you that Jet is named after a horse, and there's a picture of a horse crossing Abbey Road crosswalk, the famous crosswalk with Linda, and that horse is also named Jet. But he didn't have that horse until way after Jet was written and recorded and out. I mean, years later.
Yeah.
So, now I'm not saying that he's lying. I think he just sort of, this isn't the most important stuff in the universe to.
Exactly.
So
That's
this
funny.
is why, I mean, we have Adrian and I in our archives that we've assembled to use for this book, just things we've collected all our lives and things that Adrian has gotten during his research trips. And uh, we have thousands, literally thousands of Paul McCartney interviews on audio, video, and in print. And what we've always tried to do is go back to the interview that is closest to the event that we're writing about on the theory that that will probably be the most accurate. Um, it's not always the case because sometimes people have an agenda at the time something's happening that prevents them from telling absolutely every detail of the story or whatever. And so maybe sometimes later they're more accurate because they feel free to say. But generally speaking, we feel that what he says close to the event is probably the most accurate telling. And so we go for that when we can. But
Yep.
sometimes he doesn't talk about these things for a couple of decades. So, it depends what he's asked.
How about his war with the music press, like NME? There's a story about a is it Charles Shar Murray of
Great.
NME. A little
Yes.
back and forth, a little tense back and forth there.
Very, yes. Charles Shaar Murray, I mean, earlier on, wrote some very positive reviews of Wings. But for some reason, he just hated Venus and Mars. And he went to interview Paul. And the interview, judging from the write-up, which basically included absolutely every second of the interview, including Paul saying, and he just left everything in. Uh, Judging from that, it looks like the interview was a little bit snarky to begin with, and put Paul a bit on the defensive. But then he called the piece something like, "How do you tell a Beatle he's made a crappy album?" Something like that. And then subsequently really pans a number of other of subsequent singles and albums and things. And so Paul really took this to heart, this Charles Shaar Murray interview, and was really angry about it. And, even as recently as, maybe less than 10 years ago, there was an interview he did for BBC where he mentioned that interview specifically, or I think he talked about it as a review because in the piece, Charles Shaar Murray actually does also review the record, and it still bothers him, decades later. So yeah, and so for a while, NME wasn't invited to certain press conferences, and basically, if they had a request, it would be denied. So an NME noticed this, and they wrote about it as well. That's in a way one journalistic thing you can do. I mean, I remember from my time at the New York Times is you can if you've been banned from something, you can mention in print that you've been banned from it, and it's actually in some ways more embarrassing to the person who banned you than it is to you.
Yeah,
So.
makes them look like they're thin-skinned.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's what NME did. And then eventually Paul and NME got back, on track. But yeah, there was a very fraught time between Paul and NME there.
Before my next question, I just want to share. There's some great stories throughout the book. There's one that I wanted to share, and it's the one where Paul's talking about seeing Jaws. And you right here, the McCartney spent the Fourth of July weekend with the Eastmans in East Hampton. Evenings, Paul and Linda slipped out to the local cinema to catch a handful of movies, including Robert Altman's musical drama Nashville and Steven Spielberg's killer shark thriller Jaws. During the day, Paul continued to hone his fitness levels off the coast of Long Island. Paul said, "We saw Jaws on July 3, so the next day we were swimming cautiously." Those are great entries throughout the book. Just take you back in time. Allan Kozinn, co-author of the McCartney Legacy Volume 2, 1974 to 1980, along with, of course, Adrian Sinclair. Adrian would have been here, but it's like 11:30, or now it's past midnight where he is in the UK. So
Yeah.
we'll say hello to Adrian. The Wings of the World Tour 76 featured Beatles songs. This was a big deal, right? Because he hadn't played Beatles songs in a while. He included Yesterday, Lady Madonna, and The Long and Winding Road. So why did he hold on? I think I know the answer to this, but talk about why he held off on playing Beatles songs for a while, why he decides finally to include them on this particular tour.
I think Band on the Run had a lot to do with it, or the success of Band on the Run, because In the build up to Band on the Run, it was, you know what? I don't want to coast on the Beatles stuff. I want to establish Wings as Wings, you know? And even though the players in Wings wanted to play Beatles stuff, and they tried it in '73. They played a couple of songs at a show at a TV taping for the James Paul McCartney TV special, and then that night they did a charity show at the Hard Rock Cafe in London and played the same set with I think it was Long and Winding Road, but he didn't really want to incorporate that into touring, and because he wanted to establish Wings as its own band, no Beatles covers, nothing like that, and with Band on the Run and the success that it had, I think he felt finally, okay, I have now shown that I can make a spectacular album that everybody loves, including critics. So now, we'll go out on tour and maybe I'll add a few Beatles songs. I think he played like five on that tour. Um, and and the response was obviously going to be very gratifying for him. When they played yesterday in Zagreb, in Yugoslavia, the audience sang along in English the whole song. And we interviewed, among the people we interviewed were his sound crew. And they said, yeah, he's looking off to the side of the stage like, what? Wow. And at the end, he played it again as an encore, something he never did. I mean, he only did it at that show. And they sang again, and with foot stamping and the whole thing. It was incredibly enthusiastic, and so after that, well, he played it all through the '75, '76 tour, and then he didn't tour again till '89. And when he toured again, Beatles songs were acceptable. I mean, '89. Now it's a totally different thing. People were not going to be constantly asking him, couldn't the Beatles get back together? Because John had been shot, it just wasn't going to happen. So I think he felt a bit better about playing the stuff without having to worry about whether there's going to be talk of a Beatles reunion. And, and I think he just realized eventually that also, by '89, he was no longer trying to establish Wings. Wings was gone. Now it was Paul and a backing band, and Paul could rightfully assert ownership of that part of the Beatles catalog that he wrote. And then ultimately he went further than that. I mean, on various of his tours, he's played versions of Strawberry Fields, Mr. Kite, various things that we associate with John specifically. So, and he's said, actually, you weren't there, and I did contribute to these songs. You think of it as a John song, but I was involved. So there's that.
Silly Love Songs from
Hmm.
1976's Wings at the Speed of Sound, huge hit, and you write, quote, Silly Love Songs and Bohemian Rhapsody are very different songs, but they share certain features beyond vocal counterpoint, namely an episodic structure. The recording would have to be carefully planned if all the song's elements were to fall into place. Paul said that. Do you agree with that? Did you find that? Because I never thought about that. I mean, I've heard the song a million times.
Yeah, I would never have associated the two, but now looking more closely at Silly Love Songs, I can see why there's that association because of the episodic aspect, because of the vocal counterpoint. Bohemian Rhapsody is pretty sophisticated in terms of vocal counterpoint, and Silly Love Songs too. I mean, he has different lines with different lyrics sort of going against each other, and it's not that straightforward. It's funny because Silly Love Songs, I've run into this lots of times with these two books, where Silly Love Songs was a song that I never really particularly liked. I didn't hate it, but it wasn't a favorite. But taking it apart and looking closely at how it was done, and going back to, we have Paul's sort of handwritten manuscript of it on the back of an envelope, showing like a schematic of the complicated episodic aspects and where they go. Um, Gave me a really new respect for that song that I hadn't had before. And the fact, listen to his bass line in that. It's quite a complicated bass line, and that's different from what he had been doing as a member of Wings. During the Beatles, his bass lines were always contrapuntal and always, really sophisticated, not just outlining the chords, like a lot of people do. I mean, they were pieces of art in themselves, just the bass line. And then with Wings, it was a lot simpler. And when people would ask him, how come, your bass lines are so much simpler now than they were with the Beatles? And he would say, well, but that's the style now. Uh, but with Silly Love Songs, it is back to an absolute Beatles level Paul McCartney bass line. And that's something I admire about that too. So, silly love songs, I had a totally new attitude about it than I did before I started the book. And that's happened with a number of songs. And that's why I think that the same way that when Ram came out, it got a lot of scathing reviews and a lot of people didn't like it. But now you ask people, and Ram is like one of his best albums,
I've
right?
heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that will happen with Back to the Egg, the album that's the last one that comes out during this period in volume two. It's really a good album. And, even Paul has said that he was a little disappointed in it, but he heard it again recently. His son played it, and he realized that it really was actually pretty good. So, um, I think other people will come around too.
There was a solo concept album in 1977 called Thrillington. This was shelved going back to like early 70s, right? Like 72, 73,
71.
71. Yeah.
Right after the Ram album came out, he decided that he wanted a full album cover of Ram, but done in a totally different way. He wanted it to be orchestral, uh, but the arranger he hired, Richard Hewson, um, was more of a jazz guy. So it's a little jazzy, a little bit of a cocktail orchestra kind of sound. He recorded it, produced it, and it sat on the shelf from 1971 to 1977, and then he decided to bring it out. He does that a lot. I mentioned One Hand Clapping earlier. That was recorded in 74, just came out this year. That's 50 years that sat on the shelf.
Wow. Yeah. Talk about ahead of his time, too. The marketing campaign for Thrillington.
Mhm.
Who's Percy Thrillington, or what is the Percy Thrillington promotion? That was
Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah, yeah, because Percy Thrillington didn't exist, of course. It
Right.
was, but Paul decided, had this idea that, we're going to have this album done by a conductor named Percy Thrillington. Um, and we're going to make up a myth for Percy Thrillington and how Paul discovered him and signed him to MPL and all that. And they took out all these little ads, little personal ads. Percy Thrillington says that you should have a hot bath, or you should go to this debutante ball, or whatever. And we reproduced all of those little ads as the inner papers of the book. I can show you if well, I'm not sure how well it can be seen, but here are
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
so
Yeah. Percy Thrillington.
yeah, yeah, we had a good time with that, and it's kind of funny because it's the recording sessions for it are in volume one, and the preparations for the release and making the cover and doing these ads and all of that are in volume two. So, the story stretches over. We're hoping eventually we think the series will take like 5 volumes.
I heard you were on another podcast, and I was listening to both of you talk about that, which would be great because there's a lot more left to cover. Yeah, there's a lot more. Like even his most recent stuff, some of the stuff I love is the fireman sessions. I thought was great.
There's really a lot. I mean, he is constantly busy.
October 78, This story I love. McCartney assembled a rock orchestra of famous names to record a song. I was just listening to the song the other day. Fascinated by this. Pete Townsend, Hank Marvin, David Gilmour, and John Bonham.
Mhm.
Tell us about this. There's also some people that almost joined: Jeff Beck, Elton John, Ringo Starr, and Keith Moon.
The Rockestra theme, but the group itself was referred to as
Right,
Rockestra.
right.
Yeah, he had this idea for a TV show that was going to be a battle between a classical orchestra and a rock band. Um, and this has, in a way, nothing to do with as he envisioned it. It just became this one song. But that was the genesis of this idea. And he just sort of called up everybody and said, "You want to come down to the studio and do this thing?" And he wrote a very simple thing. Rock was not complicated, and because it couldn't be complicated, they were just going to all turn up in the studio that day and record it right then. So it's simple, and
But it's
but
a great song. I love it.
it's cool. It is a cool song, and and he also had it filmed. But he decided that because he didn't want the players to be self-conscious about the camera or mugging for it or anything, uh, he would have the camera hidden in the studio. So they built a fake wall and the camera's behind it. They weren't able to use the film because since he didn't want anybody to know that he was filming, he obviously didn't have them sign releases.
Yeah.
And without releases, you can't put anything out. So he's got this film of Rockestra. It's been bootlegged. People have seen it, but and then they reprised it at the Kampuchea concerts in 1979, at the end of December 1979 in London. He reassembled most of this group, um, and they did a couple of songs. They did the Rockestra theme and Lucille, little Richard track that was one of Paul's favorites during the Hamburg era Beatles.
That might have been
So
One of John Bonham's last recordings before he passed.
I don't
Because
know.
Bonham died in
Um,
1980. So it
mhm.
wasn't too long. And that's the reason why Keith Moon didn't, right? Didn't Keith Moon, he passed away before they
He passed
recorded it.
away he passed away, yeah, during the time they were working on Back to the Egg.
Yeah.
Um,
So they were going to he
and
was going to reach out to Keith Moon, but he passed. What about Jeff Beck, Elton John, Ringo Starr? What were the reasons they
Uh,
didn't take part?
Jeff Beck, Jeff Beck wanted approvals of, the music and what he'd play and various things that Paul considered unwieldy or that he just didn't want to do. Elton John, I believe, had another recording session that day, so he couldn't make it. And I'm not sure what the story was with Ringo.
Ringo. Wings released 1978's London Town, which includes With a Little Luck. They're down to a trio now: Paul, Linda, and Denny Lane. Guitarist
Right.
Lawrence Juber and drummer Steve Holley on Back to the Egg.
Right.
Right? Okay, this is the last Wings album. Respectable numbers, but not what Columbia was expecting. You state in the book that Paul may have been feeling the pressure from the enormity of a deal with Columbia that triggered and magnified his insecurities.
I don't know that it affected the songs on Back to the Egg. I think it affected um, the way he marketed or didn't bother marketing Back to the Egg. He signed this new deal with Columbia, which not only gave him what was reported as like the, highest royalty anybody was getting and the highest advance anybody got, but also Columbia gave him a publishing company that they had owned and had, tons of interesting copyrights. Paul, there's another aspect of Paul that people don't often think about, which is his sideline as a music publisher. Started in volume one when he bought Buddy Holly's catalog. His father-in-law, Lee Eastman, uh, was also involved in music publishing. That was one of the things that he did as an investment. And when Paul was talking about, what do I do to be able to keep some of my money once it gets out of Apple, or even just the bit that I've still got. And Lee said, well, you should do what you love. and what you love is music, and I know something about music publishing. Let me show you. And so Paul began buying these catalogs, and he ended up owning, enormous numbers of standards and Broadway shows and all the Buddy Holly stuff. And he's very serious about his publishing empire. And that actually, there were other companies bidding for Paul, and the publishing basically put Columbia over the edge. And so he's got this enormous new deal. He finishes the album, he sends it to Columbia and does a single, Good Night Tonight, uh, and Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, two tracks that weren't on the album and are, extraordinary tracks in their own way. Columbia wanted them on the album, just as Al Corey would have at Capitol. And Paul said, no, not putting him on the album. So Columbia is already a little upset at that. And then he says, you know what? I'm not coming to the States to promote this album, but I'll send the two newest Wings members, Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley, to do whatever interviews you want done. Um, Steve and Lawrence are wonderful guys and great musicians, but probably most people would have wanted to talk to Paul, not to them. And so Columbia was again a little upset at the fact that okay, we've forked over all this money and a publishing company, and we're not even getting him to come over and do some interviews, let alone tour. So, they were a bit upset about that, but and that's possibly why it didn't sell as well as it could have because he didn't get behind it.
I think there's some good songs. Old Siam Sir, Getting Closer, Arrow Through Me. Rockestra Theme, actually, that was released in Europe as a single,
Hmm.
if I'm seeing
My
correctly here.
Baby's Request.
Yeah.
My Baby's
Yeah.
Request is a gorgeous song, and it almost didn't end up on the album because he didn't write it for the album. He wrote it for uh, one of those sort of old-time vocal quartets that of our parents' generation, who he went to see and in Europe, in France, and they came and said, "Can you write us a song?" And he said, "Sure." And he wrote that song totally in their style. Their manager sent him a note saying, "Yeah, they'll record it for $1,000." And Paul said, "Well, that's sort of not the deal." So he took the demo that he recorded with Wings and put it on the Back to the Egg album. And it's a great track with a great opening guitar flourish by Lawrence Juber. Um, it's and it was one of the ones that they made a video for. So
So winding down with 1980s McCartney 2, that's a departure for Paul. That's a solo project. Much of it relies on synthesizers, studio experimentation. From reading the book, it seems like Paul was thinking about going solo on that last Wings tour. Like he officially announced that Wings were no longer, I think, in '82, I believe. But what was his reason or reasons for going solo? He was kind of feeling like it was too much weight on his shoulders.
I think he finally realized that he didn't really want the headache of running a band. Um, Even though this version of Wings was probably the least headache producing of any of the former ones because nobody was complaining. Nobody was insisting on doing things their way rather than what Paul wanted. They were significantly younger than Paul and they were doing what he wanted done. Lawrence Juber was, an excellent guitarist. He was classically trained and he had experience playing in a jazz orchestra. He had a lot of studio experience, recorded everything from, James Bond movies to, jazz records and some rock and Steve Holley had been touring we recorded with Elton John, recorded a full album with Elton John. um, and I think he was touring with Kiki D as well. So he also had a lot of experience. So you've got these two guys who are doing everything Paul wants, not giving him any pushback, having a great time. And he decides that he's had enough of running a band. So I don't totally understand it because you would think that finally it's gotten to be what he wanted it to be. Um, but also, this is really more for the next book, but when they went to record Tug of War, um, he wanted George Martin to produce it, which for the first time since he worked with George Martin with the Beatles. And George Martin didn't want it to be a Wings album. He wanted it to be a solo Paul McCartney album. And with that and everything else, he just decided to hang up the idea of Wings. And unfortunately, though, he didn't tell the other members of Wings this. They read it in the music press
Oof.
and called him up and said, I'm so Paul, we read this thing." And he's, "Oh, yeah, I've been meaning to call you."
Oof.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah, and that was it. And he went on his own. Just one last question, because there's a photo in the book of Paul in handcuffs, and it's just so it's just bizarre to see Paul in handcuffs. What happened on January 16th, 1980?
Well, they flew into Japan to do a short tour of Japan after the 1979 British tour with Wings. And Paul had been warned by everybody not to bring pot into Japan because it's not the West. Well, it's kind of a westernized country now, but it's a different kind of place, and they don't tolerate that, and you'll be in jail for a long time. Uh, Everyone told him that. Chris Thomas told him that, who produced Back to the Egg. Other musicians told him that, but for some reason he decided to bring a significant amount of pot in his suitcase, just in his suitcase under a sweater,
Yeah.
and they landed, and also he could have known too because he was supposed to tour with Wings in 1975, and he had his visas and everything, and the Japanese government in the last minute said, "You know what? He's had some pot busts. We don't want him to come into the country." So he knew what the Japanese attitude towards marijuana was. Um, Got online. Lawrence Juber is standing right next to him. He's got a brand new Gibson guitar that he just found in New York on the way to Japan. Guy opens the suitcase, puts his hand in. Uh-oh, what have I got here? Takes out the pot, and suddenly Paul and Lawrence Juber are led into separate rooms. Juber had to sit there while, well, guy comes in with a screwdriver, has him take the guitar apart to show
Oh,
that there isn't any marijuana in the guitar. And Paul is arrested and led away in handcuffs. And the book pretty much ends there. It goes on a little bit
yeah.
more, but it describes basically Wing's reaction to the news because they're just getting the news. And I'm going to post this on one of my social medias tomorrow, probably. But we have a clip from the audiobook of you know Denny and Chris Thomas. Chris Thomas, the producer, went on this tour with them, and by the time he gets to his room, he gets a phone call from Denny saying, "Turn on the TV." And Chris Thomas says, "What channel?" And Denny says, "Doesn't matter."
Yeah. Any
All
any
over
of them.
television, is like this was a big thing.
Sure.
Yeah. Uh,
Wow.
they decided to unwind by going out to a club after that. And they basically said, on the way to the club, there were posters for the Wings tour on every single telephone pole. On the way back from the club, they were all gone. Mhm.
Oh. All right. So, what are the plans for volume three, four, and
Oh,
five too? What are the plans
yeah.
for the future?
Well, the way we're looking at it now, and things change, but volume three will cover all of the 80s. Volume four will cover the 90s. And volume five will be from 2000 until whenever we're finished.
Yeah.
And that'll take us a while. It'll take us a bit longer to do volume three than it took to do volume two because we basically had done the research for volumes one and two together. Um,
Yeah. Well,
you know,
because you mentioned there was a, as far as who's going to publish it, there was just a two-book deal initially. Is that what I heard? Or
right.
yeah,
We initially had a two-book deal with Day Street, and we will at some point soon after this one comes out, be discussing the future with them again. We talked to them. Well, when we first signed the deal, I had lunch with our editor and publisher, and she said, "So how many volumes do you think it would take to do the whole story?" And I said five. And the look of horror on her face made me say, I mean four.
did I say
But
five? I
then,
meant four.
yeah, but then last February, when we were at Fest for Beatles fans, signing books, she popped by and we had a chat with her. And she said, "So, do you think you can do five volumes?" And I said, "Yeah." So we'll see how it goes, but we do need to have some more meetings with them and see what their feeling is. And if they don't want to do it, I'm not sure. We'll I guess we'll try and find another publisher. But you don't want to break up a series like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it. I think maybe my favorite Paul song solo from the '80s would be "No More Lonely Nights" with David Gilmour. Just
Mm,
there's songs that I'm really looking forward to reading about in the albums. Of course, his work with Elvis Costello, right, and "Flowers in the Dirt," and
yeah.
all that stuff. So I'm really looking forward to it. Right now, though, everybody can go out and get volumes 1 and 2. The McCartney Legacy Volume 1 covers 1969 to 1973. That's the red one.
Yep.
And Volume 2, 74 to 80, is the blue one. And they're both out now. You can find them wherever books are sold. Now, what about where can people find you online, Alan? Is there a website for the book series?
There is a website for the book, which is mccartneylegacy.co.uk. Day Street Books also has a website for it, which I think is called mccartneylegacy.com.
You can look it
We
up.
have a Facebook page. We're all over the place.
Cool. I'll put the links on the show notes. I'll look them all up and make sure people can click the link and check those out. Allan Kozinn, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.